Hello, this is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy, and I have the pleasure of speaking with Kevin Watson, who teaches Methodist Studies at Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta, and is distinguished for having written several important books, especially focusing on the importance of Methodist class meetings, not just in Methodist history, but also their application for today in terms of church renewal. His latest book is this right here on two important individuals in Methodist history, Bishop Matthew Simpson, often best recalled as a friend of President Abraham Lincoln, but a leading religious, cultural, and political figure in the mid-19th century. And the other person featured in the book was in a sort of debate or conflict with Bishop Simpson, and Kevin will tell us more about this debate and not just what it says about Methodism in the 19th century, but how its legacy is arguably playing out today in terms of the theological divisions that exist within Methodism, and which may lead us to a formal schism in the United Methodist Church when the next General Conference meets at some point late next year. So Kevin, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And I didn't share a lot of your bio, but just briefly tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, your church background, and how you came to be a professor at Candler School of Theology.
Yeah, I'm a member of the Oklahoma Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church, so I'm a United Methodist elder. I went to seminary at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., and then pastored for 3 years in Oklahoma, in Lamont, Oklahoma, which was a wonderful place to get experience in ministry. Enjoyed being with those folks, and actually still think about that church almost every time I teach. And then started a PhD at Southern Methodist University. Ted Campbell was my advisor. Also worked with Billy Abraham, Elaine Heath, and Bruce Marshall quite a bit there at SMU. And then from SMU, I got a job teaching at Seattle Pacific University when they were approved as a part of the University Senate's list of approved schools, which was a fun milestone to get to be there when it happened, and taught a variety of courses at SPU, both undergrad and seminary courses. But the heartbeat of my calling has felt like it's been to work for the renewal of the Methodist movement, the Wesleyan tradition. And so when there was an opportunity to come to Candler to teach Methodist studies almost exclusively, both in terms of I teach the Methodist history, and now it's history and doctrine course, and then I get to teach electives in the history of Methodism, which are particularly fun to get to teach on. The main ones I've taught are the method of early Methodism, which focuses on the societies, classes, and bands, their background and history, and the role they played in Methodism and their theology, and then looking at some different ways in which they have been sort of reclaimed in attempts to bring us back to that approach. And then I've also taught a class called The Holiness Movement in American Methodism that looks at sort of this era. So I kind of have done an elective that centers around each of the monographs that I've written.
Now, many people tend to focus, for understandable reasons, on all the conflict and controversies within especially United Methodism, but it's my observation that there seems to be a renaissance of Methodism, at least within academia, the increased study of or scholarship in wider Wesleyan studies. Would you say that's been accurate the last 10 or 15 years?
Yeah, I think that is true. For me, it's there have been real strengths, I would say, in the kind of key Methodist research universities and the faculty that were there in that time period that you talked about. And I think that has caused, and I think especially SMU had a strong tradition, I think before this, but then when Duke added a THD, I think that enabled them to use some of their core faculty who sometimes had trouble, I think, getting students admitted to the PhD program. And yeah, there's a lot of folks doing great work right now in the academy.
Now, a lot of people tend to portray the current division within United Methodism is tracing back to early 20th century or 1920s debates between revisionist or modernist and the orthodox. But your book would seem to say for Methodism, it really dates back much earlier, and this debate between Bishop Matthew Simpson and B.T. Roberts perhaps embodies that difference of opinion. Is that basically one of the themes of your book?
Yeah, that's a good summary. I think that the part of what I was trying to do is to start, my feeling is that the conversations about the Methodist theological tradition are oftentimes not very substantive or not as careful as they could be. And so I was trying to figure out how to look more carefully at where did this sort of sense of an identity of what it means to be a Methodist seem to start to be argued about and contested. And so I try to, I don't do this in the depth that certainly could be done, but to look at some of the first divisions, because in some ways the history of Methodism in the US is a history of divisions. But I look at some of the first divisions and argue that those divisions weren't actually about the meaning of the tradition theologically, but that there was actually agreement there and the divisions come along other lines. But that when you look at the division that led to the Free Methodist Church, it's the first time to me that it's explicitly like they're talking about theology, and there's a different understanding of what it means theologically to be Methodist and how important boundaries are around that and so forth. And I think it's one of the first times you see the sort of like articulation of a potential big tent Methodist vision, and then someone who's actually pretty strongly resisting it.
Well, if you could tell us a little bit more about what new Methodism was versus old school Methodism, and a little bit about the personality and background of B.T. Roberts.
Yeah, so the title of the book comes from an essay that B.T. Roberts wrote called New School Methodism. And it was an insult, like it was intended to be a critique. And so he's describing a new school that he thinks is wrong. It's not actually Methodist. And in some ways he seems to be saying it's not clearly even Christian to him. And so his sort of the counterpoint, which I don't remember him necessarily saying explicitly, but framing it for the title itself is, so you have old school Methodism or new school Methodism. And so part of the background of that is to say that you've kind of gone about this in different ways, but one of the things I was trying to do in the book is to correct what I see as a tendency by many people in recent kind of study of Methodism historically to sort of privilege a big tent vision of Methodism at the outset, so that a lot of the scholarship they do actually presumes the validity of that understanding. And this came out of me actually reading different historical figures and noticing that they actually fought in like intense ways, even to the point of division over that very idea. And so there are people throughout the history of the Methodist tradition in the US who actually contested the big tent vision and thought that it actually was anti-Methodist. And the other thing I thought was interesting about it, so getting to B.T. Roberts, he writes this essay and he's basically trying to call Methodism back to what he understands to be the core principles and commitments that gave Methodism its vitality for its first 75 years or so. And those are things like he talks about the class meeting a lot, this social holiness, which is not a synonym for social justice, but is a synonym for the need to pursue holiness in community and in connection with one another, which doesn't preclude social justice. Social justice would be a part of that, but it's just a much bigger concept than the ways it's often used today. And so the class meeting is one of those that he talks about. So he's noting that there's a kind of move away from that. He's also talking about and noting that Methodist preachers seem to be shying away from clear preaching and teaching about holiness itself, just the doctrine of holiness, and particularly entire sanctification. So the original essay is in two parts, and it focuses on basically doctrine, different differences in doctrine. And the second part, he talks about usages or practices, differences in the ways that this is practiced today. And part of what I think is interesting about this history is that there's a myth, I think, a lot of times in the broad history of the way that people think about differences of perspectives across the theological spectrum in contemporary United Methodism, where one side is open and tolerant and desires to be inclusive, and another side is exclusive and has very narrow understandings and so forth. And this history kind of turns out on its head because B.T. Roberts is the kind of more conservative, he's trying to conserve this tradition. And he's actually brought up on charges in his annual conference for immoral and unchristian conduct. That's the charges that were brought against him. And then the specifics of the charges relate to things he wrote in this essay. So the essay was so offensive to the New School Methodists that they basically tried to get him kicked out of the conference. And the annual conference that first year centered all around his trial, and he was convicted ultimately. And the bishop recommended basically sort of like a warning, a slap on the wrist, which they ended up giving him. But then a layperson basically was so outraged by the trial that he wrote a lengthy sort of description of it and protesting, in a sense, what was happening, and reprinted New School Methodism in that pamphlet to basically say, look, this is all he said, and this whole thing happened because of this. And because that tract was republished, B.T. Roberts was actually tried again at the next annual conference, again for immoral and unchristian conduct. And that trial, I think it's fair to say, was more of a farce than the first one, because it became, George Estes wrote the pamphlet that second year, and he testified that, like, he said he wrote it. Like, it wasn't, no one was disputing by the end of the trial who wrote the pamphlet. And yet Roberts remained on trial for these charges. And part of what Roberts says later, and I don't think very many people long after the fact really disputed this, was that a decision had kind of already been made that he needed to go by the power brokers in the conference. And this gets us kind of into the weeds, but one of the pieces of this is that secret societies were really predominant. They were popular in this period of time. And so Roberts was also rejecting the appropriateness of Methodist preachers being involved in secret societies like Masons or Oddfellows. And there was a pretty strong sort of suggestion that, and there's actually some evidence in some of the manuscript material that some of the key leaders of his opposition were involved in secret societies, so that the decisions were being made in those secret societies that wasn't visible to the conference and the clergy of the conference as a whole. In any event, he was convicted again for immoral and unchristian conduct, basically because they got one person to testify that they saw B.T. Roberts give a copy of that pamphlet to one person on a train ride. And that time he was actually expelled from the ministry and from the Methodist Episcopal Church. He appealed both of the trials, both of his convictions. And at the 1860 General Conference, his appeals were tabled due to a compromise made between the Genesee Conference, his annual conference, which was strongly abolitionist. They made a compromise with some of the northern conferences to not oppose, basically not push through abolitionism at the General Conference if those conferences would vote with them to table his appeal. So there's kind of an unholy alliance. And once that appeal was basically denied by being tabled, he had no recourse but to start the Free Methodist Church. So the point of kind of taking you through all that is to see that the Free Methodist Church was founded not because, the narrative is oftentimes these holiness Methodists left because they got fed up and disgusted with the so-called mainline branch. And in the case of the Free Methodist Church, that's actually not what happened. What happened was that he was actually actively sort of gone after charges were brought against him. He was expelled from the church and even appealed. He did everything he could to stay until there was no longer any recourse. And at that point, he didn't have a home in the Methodist Episcopal Church anymore. And then the Free Methodist Church was born after that. More briefly, Matthew Simpson, he's actually much more influential in the history of American Methodism as far as the dominant sort of line. And part of it is because of his famous relationship with Abraham Lincoln. Simpson is the most influential bishop of kind of his era. He was elected to the episcopacy in 1852. And he is kind of the main advocate for Methodism. He sees Methodism as something that is, can be in harmony with the dominant prevailing culture, and that he kind of sees Methodism in America as kind of running in parallel with each other as a part of God's providence and purposes, that Methodism is kind of the special tool that God is using to bless America and through America, the nations. And so there's, he has these sermons that he preaches that are kind of these really strong exhortations for the unique significance of Methodism for the sake of the U.S. and then for the sake of the world. And so he wants Methodism to build better institutions like schools of theology and parsonages. Basically, he's like, we have all the people, but we don't have the same structures. We don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the refinement that should be expressed based on the people that we have. So he talks a lot about a cultured and refined Methodism for cultured and refined people. And that's the sort of the other piece of this history that I think is interesting, is Roberts tends to make a contrast between kind of holiness and old school Methodism and worldliness and sort of the new school Methodism, which he sees as being compromised in pursuit of the approval of the world and the ways of the world. And Simpson kind of represents that alternative perspective.
It's my impression from reading, especially, it must have been Darius Salter's biography of Bishop Simpson, that Simpson himself was a man of sincere piety and probably orthodox in his theology. But as you say, he just had this vision of this great synergy between the nation and the church that took him in a very different direction.
Yeah, the thing that is interesting to me about Simpson, I'm not at the level of sort of expertise on him that like Salter is, or that like Howard Snyder is for B.T. Roberts, who wrote the really excellent critical biography of B.T. Roberts. But I spent a lot of time at the Library of Congress reading through his papers, and I talk about this in the book. It's interesting to me that Simpson does not have a typical Methodist conversion experience. And so I think you're right that he is orthodox in his theology. I don't recall ever reading anything from him that has a suggestion of being heretical. He's certainly not innovative doctrinal in the ways that you would see more commonly in contemporary Methodism today. But it is also interesting that I detect in him a kind of, this is me sort of speaking a bit off the cuff and less carefully as a historian, but I detect almost a kind of like insecurity, like a spiritual insecurity in him, that he knows what the experience is, that is the prototypical Methodist experience of justification by faith and new birth and assurance. But he doesn't seem to have the actual confidence that he himself has had that experience. He certainly does not testify to entire sanctification in his ministry. And there's one of the most interesting letters I read was actually Phoebe Palmer writing to him and sort of chastising him for not being more serious in pursuing that particular doctrine. And it seemed like their correspondence sort of decreased after that letter.
Well, I recall his son had a dramatic conversion experience at a campground in New Jersey, which he greatly rejoiced over, but maybe he was celebrating for his son what he himself had never fully experienced.
Yeah. I mean, when he goes to a revival early on, and he tells the experience of him going to the altar, but he tells it in a way that he went to the altar because he knew he could get his friend to go with him, and his friend gets converted, but he's actually pretty. And one of the things I really appreciate about him, he's honest. Like he's seems very introspective, and we have his diaries and those kind of things is where some of this comes from, and he seems to sort of have this conscientiousness that what happened to me there is not what happened to my friend there, and there was a difference. And I'm not in saying this trying to make strong distinctions. Like I'm not saying I don't think that he was a Christian. But I am saying he doesn't have the kind of like circuit rider stereotypical conversion experience, at least as far as we know or can see.
And so do you think there really is a direct line from these differences in the 1850s and 1860s straight through to the 20th century in terms of the ultimate theological divisions within the larger Methodist Church?
I think there are some significant points of connection. What I think is most interesting about the UMC when I'm teaching Methodist history that I'll say to my students is that the United Methodist Church, it's maybe its greatest strength and its greatest weakness is that, okay, so the history would be easier if if you had B.T. Roberts and Matthew Simpson, and going forward from this, you literally have two clear and distinct traditions that are represented by each of them. But that's actually not the case. What you have in the United Methodist Church is all of those traditions together under one denomination. And that's a great strength. And so you also have the Free Methodist Church and the Wesleyan Church and, the Church of the Nazarene. You have the traditionally African-American denominations. But you have in the UMC people, the way I put it is, who could just as easily and maybe more sort of coherently fit in these other traditions. And then you've also got folks who might fit better in the Episcopal Church or even the Unitarian Universalist Church. I mean, you just kind of have folks all over the place who are members of, and in some cases even in leadership in the United Methodist Church. And so it makes the history more complex in that sense. But part of what I think I'm arguing in this book is that Matthew Simpson is the one who sort of creates the beginning of the opening that lets you get to that place where the UMC can sort of accommodate that broad breadth of theological perspective, which I would actually see ultimately, like today, the way it's expressed as deeply incoherent in a way that's problematic and unhelpful. And I think Simpson himself would see it that way. If we jumped ahead 100 years, I think the same thing is true of Albert Outler. Albert Outler makes some moves to try to have, I think rightly, a sort of an open expression of Methodism where he assumes basic Christian orthodoxy, and he ends up, I think, inadvertently creating something that he didn't intend to create. It takes on a life of its own through the quadrilateral, the way that theological pluralism is understood, and I think he would say misunderstood. And so you kind of have these two different steps, but Outler's building on something that's already started, and Simpson is in in the 19th century actually talking about there's some different sermons where he's preaching. And I think he's even using the word ecumenism, but he's just talking to a Methodist audience, and so he's kind of he has this vision for breadth and tolerance, but he's actually applying it to Methodists particularly, which is one of the, and so he talks about Catholic spirit. And that's one of the things that's always frustrated me about the use of the sermon, Wesley's sermon, Catholic spirit, is that Methodists use Catholic spirit and they apply it internally to themselves, when the point of the sermon isn't about how Methodists can agree to disagree as one denomination. It's that this is how Methodists can see Jesus and Jesus's work in Baptists, right? And people who are not Methodist. And that's why it's a Catholic spirit, not a Methodist spirit. And Simpson, I think, is as far as I've been able to trace, he's the first person who's making that kind of move, who's applying a kind of universal church formula to say we should see ourselves in this way, so that when we have internal disagreements and so forth, we shouldn't divide, we should stay together so we can get bigger and be more powerful and influential by being Catholic, by being ecumenical in our sensibilities and so forth. And that turns later into the 20th century, I think, in some interesting different ways in the ecumenical movement itself. But Simpson, I think, is really influential in some of those key moves he makes. And you're right, he's all of these things work because he is orthodox within a particular framework. There are people like Phineas Brzee, the founder of the Church of the Nazarene, who love Matthew Simpson. There are all these buildings that are named after him. He preaches at holiness camp meeting revivals and things like that. So he really does sort of affirm the things that kind of need to be affirmed, so he's not too alienating, but then he's also innovating in ways that don't seem threatening at the time, but also create new possibilities that I think were the consequences or implications of weren't anticipated perhaps by contemporaries.
So B.T. Roberts founds or helps to found the Free Methodist Church, and which of course survives today, but it never gains the numbers that the main Methodist Church has. So it has, I think, just under 80,000 members today in the U.S. and 1 million globally, whereas the United Methodist Church at its height had 11 million in the U.S. and today has 13 million globally. So is part of the price of remaining more faithful to the Methodist distinctives by definition a much smaller, more called out membership, or is that drawing too wide a conclusion?
I think that's a really good question. I think I think I can make arguments for both in some ways, and I think that would require much more careful. I saw the piece that you wrote on that and in response to the book, and so I think that at one level that seems very plausible to me and likely, that a lot of the holiness denominations don't expect to be huge in the way, especially if they are, the ones that are coming about in the era of the Free Methodist Church and then the Church of the Nazarene. They see this behemoth that is not them, and they don't expect to like overtake, I don't think, the Methodist Episcopal Church or the Methodist Church and then the UMC. But I think the counter argument that I would say is that Methodism has historically grown most dramatically and fastest when it has actually had, I would say, the most, in a sense, countercultural vision for what Methodism is, and has had the highest ratcheted up expectations for its membership and the highest discipline of its members, so that if you don't attend your class meeting weekly, you get removed from membership. If you violate the general rules, which aren't just 3 cliches, but are actually a list of things you shall not do, or things that you shall do and practices you must adhere to. If you're seen publicly violating those things, or basically not adhering to our way of life, our rule of life, then you're removed. And we have evidence, documentation of lists of people removed for particular reasons and so forth. And mostly it's for just not showing up. If you don't show up, there's not really space for nominal Christianity in the beginning of American Methodism. And it grows like a weed during that period of time. It's growing exponentially. I think it's in 1810 or 1812. There's this great statistic where American Methodism is growing faster than the population in every state and territory in the United States. And so it's, that's very rare to see that kind of growth, not just in a pocket, but across a wide geographic region. And so I think that's like the tension that I see is, so for example, to sort of argue with myself a little bit, the place where I think you see this, where I would want to press on it in our history, is racism and slavery. So Methodism the MEC starts out with an uncompromising prohibition of slavery, and that if people already own slaves coming into the MEC, they're on a clock for how long they have to emancipate their slaves. And if they don't by that period of time, they're told they can either leave quietly or they'll be expelled and barred from communion. So they won't only not be members. We have this idea of an open table, which sometimes gets interpreted as we'll just serve it to anybody that wants with no restrictions whatsoever. And in early Methodism, they would literally like bar someone from receiving communion if they had been a slave owner for beyond this period of time and not freed their slaves. And they couldn't return to the Eucharist until they freed their slaves. That was the only way they'd have access to the sacrament again. So it's a pretty strict discipline of membership based on that ethical vision, but they also compromise on that pretty quickly. And I think that one of the main reasons is for that sort of ability for their message to be heard in the broadest possible cultural context. And that's a really complex, every time I look at those details of that, it's hard for me to feel like it was the right decision, but it's also pretty easy to see how if they'd stuck to that original kind of clear vision, that the growth that they had at the outset might have been quite limited. But the tragedy from my perspective is we'll never know, because we do have instances of Methodist preachers who went into places where there was slavery and converted slave owners and told them when they were converted that the gospel required them to free their slaves, and they did. And so, we'll never know how that growth could have happened if you kind of kept to the pure vision. I'm more sympathetic to the kind of holiness movement side of things. I tend to think that that sort of commitment, sort of sold out commitment to what the Lord requires in desperate pursuit of holiness does tend to produce fruit, and does tend to grow and expand. But you're absolutely right. When you look at the last 100 years of American Methodism, the holiness denominations are quite a bit smaller. Let me say one last thing, and then I'll stop. Is that the other piece that I think would be interesting to look at, though, is to look at the percentage of growth of each of those groups in different times, right? What becomes the UMC has a huge jump, for example, on the Church of the Nazarene. And so looking at absolute numbers is not really fair statistically, but it would be interesting to look from 1900 to 1950, what's the growth of the Methodist Church, there's actually two key mergers that happen in that period of time. But what's the growth that happens there compared to within the Church of the Nazarene? And I actually would guess that the Church of the Nazarene, that there's periods of time in there where it's growing more rapidly in terms of percentages, even though the absolute numbers aren't the same. And I suspect the same is true of some of the other denominations at different points in time.
And that obviously remains true today. All the holiness churches are growing in the U.S. compared to United Methodist continued decline in the last 55 years. Well, finally, in conclusion, Kevin, I've mentioned the Renaissance in Methodist scholarship in academia. Do you foresee a Renaissance in Methodist belief and practice more widely in the United States? Methodism, of course, is growing globally has been declining in North America for quite some time, but can we reverse that?
I hope so. There are ways in which I'm optimistic. I hope as a Wesleyan, I'm optimistic about what's possible by the amazing grace of God. I worry that I think the formation in United Methodism has been fairly poor for a pretty significant amount of time. So I think there is tremendous need for doctrinal renewal across the board in the United Methodist Church. And I think that for me, that's not something that I always worry it'll sound like I'm blaming the laity, which is actually not what I think at all. I think that the laity have not been led well for a pretty significant period of time. And I actually think in a lot of ways, one of the most encouraging things that we're seeing are laity who are kind of rising up again and expecting to lead and being less passive and so forth. It's an unfortunate in some ways consequence of the crisis of United Methodism, where there's increasing mistrust of leadership in the church and so forth. But I think that we still have the key tools in place. We still have, I think, a beautiful theology, and the goal is, as always, not to make disciples of John Wesley, but to make disciples of Jesus Christ. We just preach the gospel with a Wesleyan accent that I think is beautiful. And I think you're right that the one of the most interesting things I have seen God do, and the admittedly fairly short amount of time I've been in the game, so to speak, is that it's been surprising to me the number of folks who have come up through the academy who are deeply orthodox in their theology, whose lives have been transformed by the gospel of Jesus Christ, who love the church, and who have a vocation, a calling to teach and write for church and academy. And the folks like Justice Hunter, Andrew Thompson, Ryan Danker, I shouldn't have started naming people. Beth Felger Jones is one whose work I have always been a fan of, and I shouldn't have started naming people because then you leave people out. But there are a number of folks who are doing that kind of work, and part of what's been so interesting to me is that there's a refusal or an unwillingness to separate. There's kind of an encouragement sometimes when you're in university settings and seminary to write for the academy, because it's the kind of publications that sort of get the most acclaim and are most helpful to you in your particular context. And I think that it's just been powerful to see that there are folks working to do high-level academic work, but who are also deeply committed to that work being in service to the church, and have kind of rejected a bifurcation of those roles, that you sort of put one hat on and take another one off, but that folks who are trying to do kind of peer review level academic writing, but still see it having a contribution and impact. And so for me, that's one of the most helpful things and most hopeful things that I see happening.
Kevin Watson, Professor of Methodist Studies at Candler School of Theology, thank you for a great conversation and for all of your work. And let me hold up your book one more time, which I commend to all of our listeners. And we'll hope to see you soon, Kevin.
Thank you.